Thanks very much, Jen. Thanks everybody for joining me on this. This is a texture webinar, and I got to be honest, this is possibly my very favorite subject in woodworking. You know, joinery is great. Putting on a first coat of finish, lots of fun. There's lots of great things about woodworking, but to me, the best thing, and maybe the most underrated, is adding texture to wood. A lot of people will know about, carving wood, um, but not many people add texture to their wood, right? You get that you've probably seen it before, right? You make a beautiful piece of furniture, and people touch it, go, oh, so smooth. It's so smooth. But I guarantee you, if you put a tiny bit of texture in one corner of that top, they won't even see how smooth the main part of the table is. They'll go right to that texture, and they'll touch it and, oh wow, how do you do this, and all that sort of thing. So it's to me it's a serious, it's a really incredible focal point of a piece. Why do we texture? Those are a few of the reasons I talked about. You can just add a focal point to a piece. And texture provides sort of, how I see it, two sort of aspects. It provides a physical texture, so you can actually touch it and feel that texture. And you can also have that visual texture as well, right? You can see it. So they're both they're both important, right? Now, give you a very brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So, off the top, a brief sort of introduction about texture, and we're going to get into some of the methods that I use. My two favorites are carving gouges and using a rotary tool, and I'll go into a lot of detail about those two. Then we're going to jump into probably about six sort of very common tools we'll all have on hand, and give you a few tips as to how you can use those to add texture to your furniture as well. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about whitewood sanding, so sanding before you're texturing, that sort of thing. Then we're going to talk about finishing a piece that has texture on it. And at that point, we will open things up to questions. And I think I wouldn't mind opening up things up to questions a couple times as well, after the carving gouges section and the rotary tools section. So anyways, that gives you a brief overview as to what we're going to be talking about tonight. So first tip, experiment, right? So many, I mean, you can see all of these things here. If I can get that in the light there, different textures there. All of these panels are just, it's so hard to see if I don't get the right light, but all of these panels are just me playing around, right? And you just have to do it. I've made so many of these panels, and many of them turn out to be not very good, not giving me the effect that I want. So I try something else, right? Before you take a tabletop or a door or a gable panel or a leg and start carving into it, I would strongly recommend you make up some sample panels and just experiment and see. That goes as far as applying a finish as well. Because sometimes you apply a finish on something and things don't really go as you anticipated. It's either harder to finish or it doesn't look as good. Whatever it is, go the whole way. You'll see most of these have finishes on them. Not all of them, but most of them. And as I have alluded to, I have a light, some overhead lights here, also a light on the side. Raking light is really important when you're adding texture. And by that, I mean slightly above and mostly from the side. So each bit of texture, whether it's a line or a groove or some kind of dished out surface, it catches that light. And you can see in real time very clearly what the texture is that you're leaving. If you just have strong overhead light and that's it, there's some textures that you almost can't even see, and most textures you can't see very well. So I'll often set up, I don't know if you can see it in here, but this little trouble light, I'll bring it down put it right beside where I am, maybe about 2, 3 feet over, shining sideways, so I can get a really good idea uh, of of the texture I'm leaving. So maybe the biggest thing with texture after sharpening a gouge possibly is being patient. Don't think that you can just fly through this really quickly, because you're going to be left with texture, but I can't imagine you're going to be too satisfied with it. You know, if you take these lines, these are just grooved lines, right? Not very deep. You can see how deep they are, uh, but they're all reasonably parallel. Not exactly parallel at all. But if I was just to do this, really quickly without any kind of patience, I wouldn't get the effect that I want, right? So whether that's using carving gouges or rotary tools or anything, just be patient. Sometimes you have to take twice as long or 3 times as long as you want, but um, I find it's really, really critical to getting what you want, right? Now, having said that, we're not aiming for perfection here. It's exactly the same example, right? Those lines are not parallel. I didn't lay out every one of those lines with a pencil. I didn't use a straight edge to somehow guide that carving gouge. Um, None of the things I do are are perfect, and to me, that's what gives it a lot of its charm. Right? It's not machine made. It's handmade, and you can see that in these slight imperfections. If it was perfectly parallel, straight, aligned, even, to me that it may very well be nice, but it's not a handmade operation, right? It's not a handmade thing. So that's why I say be patient, but don't look for perfection. Now, so that's a very brief overview of some general pointers and about texturing. So I'd like to get into the part about, you're going to get into your project. One of the first things you do is you choose your wood, right? Just as you do for any project, and you have to choose your wood a little bit carefully, because different woods will take textures differently. Some woods will be, I mean, you have to consider one thing: density, right? Some woods are going to be so dense that they're going to be really hard to carve, or they're going to be really hard to use a rotary tool on. Some woods are going to be really, really too soft, right? They don't really give you that crispness. Another thing you have to deal with is the porosity of the wood. If it's really like a ring porous wood, I find it rarely works out well, because of the changes in the wood as you go in and out of the ring pores. Um, I generally like to use a fairly even grained hardwood. So something like maple, cherry, walnut. This is mahogany here. This is poplar. Um, it, they're for the most part very even grained woods. I guess you could put mahogany and walnut in they have some pores in them. You can see them, but they're very even in density, and I find that gives you a more even canvas to work on. So, and that gets back to the samples. You have to use your tools to test that wood and see if that specific wood is going to give you the effect that you want, right? So, yeah, just even before you get too far, think of the wood you're going to use and practice on it. So let's get into the very first method that I use, and this is possibly my favorite method. It's carving gouges, right? So you've all probably seen carving gouges. Lots of different um, drop these. Lots of different varieties. Um, And, to be honest, it can be a little bit daunting when you first look at a website or a brochure or something like that, and you see what seems like thousands of varieties. They've all got the same handle, but the blade, it varies in width, it varies in its sweep, its curvature. Most are round curved, I guess you could call them. Some are more of a V curve, and then there's even some that are just straight skews or that sort of thing. But I don't want you to get too worried about the specifics just yet, because I'll give you a few tips. Um, one of the biggest downsides to the carving gouge approach is the expense. Single gouges could run from probably about $40 up to probably even $100 or more if you really want to spend that. Record Power has a really fantastic deal through Stockroom Supply. It's a 12-piece set of carving tools, and as opposed to charging you $40 or more per tool, this whole set's about $200. And I've used it. It's great. It's comfortable. No problems with the tool steel. It's really exceptional value. You could go to the store and buy singles for 40, 50, $60 of any manufacturer you want. But if you want to get a good cross section of, you got some wider gouges and some narrower gouges, you got a V tool, you've got different sweeps, so there's a bit of everything here. So that's sort of a tip on expense. The other thing that can be daunting to a new texturer, if that's a word, is the just confusion over what to get, right? So they basically come in the curved carving gouges basically come in with two numbers. You have your width and you have your level of curvature, essentially. The set has a bit of everything, but you also don't need, if you're a professional carver, you're going to need maybe hundreds of these tools. But if you just want to add some texture, do some light carving, then about a dozen tools is a really fantastic selection. Now, one thing that's critical with carving gouges is how sharp they are. They've really got to be sharp, or they won't give you the results that you're looking for, and it will be very frustrating. So there's lots of approaches. There's lots of hand approaches. There's some machines that will also help you. Certainly, I'm not going to get into sharpening these tonight. That could be a whole webinar or book for that matter. But just know that if you're not having luck cutting wood, it's almost for sure the fact that they're not sharp enough. So that's something that you've really got to look into. Now, move a few of these things aside. So once you have your tools, you pick them up and you realize that they're different than chisels, right? There's a fluid movement to them, and there's a number of different ways you can hold a carving gouge. But for me, it's usually only one method that I use, and that is essentially to grasp the tool. Doesn't matter what hand you use. I wouldn't think. I tend to use my left. I'm right-handed, so I find that's just comfortable to me. So just grasp it, fingers down, and at that point, yeah, you can still see there. At that point, you're going to want to anchor the heel of your hand on, whether it's the workpiece, like so, or it is the workbench, right? Something I really should have mentioned is that whatever you're working on, it's got to be fixed to your workbench. It's got to be, you've got it on in your vise, you've got it clamped down, it can't move. You need both of your hands on the tool, and you do not want that workpiece to go anywhere. That's critical. So you can anchor your hand either on the workpiece to carve or on the workbench. That's also very stable, obviously. And that should really stay there, right? That's your safety device, let's say, so that you won't, exit the workpiece and send the tool flying, or you go flying, or whatever it is. That's where that's where your pressure is, right? And just practice on some wood. It'll come pretty quickly for you. So now carving across the grain versus with the grain. I find that carving across the grain, as long as you have sharp tools, is usually easier than carving with the grain. I shouldn't say easier, it gives you better results. Across the grain, you snip those fibers off and you get no tear out. Whereas if you're going with the grain, there's a tendency, because you're carving down into the wood and back up out, when you're carving out, there's a tendency to have some chip out occur, right? You'll find that, usually with woodworking tools, going with the grain is easier. Try it the other way. Try going across the grain, just check the results and see what you get, right? Every wood's a little bit different. Every sort of technique is a little bit different as well, but just give it a shot. Now, so you've got your sharp gouges, you've got your hand position, where to add this texture. That's that's going to be different in every situation, right? You may have a situation where you want to, these are just V gouges that I've carved into some sort of a pattern. This is just sort of carving an entire surface, right? But there'd be also nothing wrong with carving just a smaller area of a surface and then leaving the rest of it untextured, right? So there's truly no rules as to where you should texture. It could be a tabletop, it could be the edge of the tabletop, it could be going across a leg just to add a few little grooves, notches, that sort of thing. It truly could be on pretty much any of the work pieces, any of the parts in a piece of furniture. Here's another few examples of little projects as well, right? Here's a little bowl, and you can see the carved, just small little gouge marks about an inch down around that rim, right? And I put them on a little bit of an angle. You could do them straight. Either way, it's just, there's no true function of that texture there. I just think it looks good, right? And that's not too much different than this one. This is a little lily pad box sort of thing. And if you'll see, I've added all sorts of little V grooves radiating out from the center. And they're not even, they're not perfectly aligned or anything like that. Probably what I did was added a few, I don't know, maybe half a dozen lines just to get me, vaguely in the ballpark. And then I carve those lines out, and I carve lines in between those, and I just fill in the whole area. And because if I was to do this completely freehand, I may end up with a center that's off center, or just some more unevenness than I really want, right? So there's a couple examples of where I add gouge texture, but it really it's if I could bring in 5 or 6 pieces of furniture to show you other examples, we could talk about those too, but I just can't fit them in here all at the same time. Um, so put these guys away here. Um, Now, another technique that I really like, what's the best, uh, it's just a small area, but it's done with a fairly wide gouge and only with a slight curvature on it. You can see this area here, right? All of those little, fairly large divots, whatever you want to call them, are done with a fairly wide gouge. And you can fill in entire areas. You could do an entire tabletop or a seat, a chair seat, chair back, that sort of thing. It's not it's not as powerful of a look as these V grooves, but it's the sort of thing that once it catches your eye, it looks really nice, and you can do it on larger areas because it isn't quite as powerful of a look, right? And depending on the size of carving gouge you use with the different sweeps and widths, you can maybe adjust that to look a little bit more pronounced or even a little bit less pronounced. So there's a lot of flexibility when you have a few tools at your disposal, and you can adjust the depth and width of those divots according to the wood, according to the piece, and that sort of thing, right? So that's a really quick overview of the carving gouges. Maybe we should get into a few questions now about the carving gouges or anything we've talked about yet. Any questions there, John?
No, we don't have any questions right now.
No.
Oh,
Okay.
wait, sorry, I said that and one popped up, so people might be putting them through. Okay.
Sure.
Um, Wondering if Rob may use printed templates or even just a pencil, or sorry, pencil in where he's going to cut when carving a surface. Where does he get his design ideas or inspiration?
Okay, don't let me forget about the inspiration and design ideas part. But yeah, I do sometimes um, pencil in, lightly where I'm going to, if there's a curve or if there's, even a line, a border around the edge, something like that, and I want it to be fairly accurate, I'll pencil it in. You can see this pattern. I started with these main curves and drew those on and cut those out with another one here with a V gouge. And then I took more pencil lines and just roughly gave probably went in the middle at first and then split that difference a little bit just to give me a general guideline. I sure didn't mark each one of these notches out, but those lines just help keep the overall look of the texture surface just doing what I want it to do, right? Going where I need it to go. Um, Now with a technique, here, this one's actually a little bit easier to see. This is the same technique I was talking about before, how it's all just grooved, divots with a wide gouge. Now, before I get too far, this is just some poplar that's been painted with a couple of types of milk paint, a kind of a coppery color and then a golden color over top of it. So don't let that confuse you. That's a whole other topic. But when I'm doing this sort of effect, I almost never draw any sort of guidelines on there. That's not to say that you shouldn't or can't, though. I just prefer a little bit more of an organic look. Like these are generally fitting together in rows across, and they're offset by one each time they go up, but they're far from perfect, right? And to me, that's usually the look that I want. If I did want to have a really, really accurate um, finished look, I could use some more lines, lay things out. Um, where are some other examples? This one, well, you can even see this. This is a piece of cherry with a piece of curly sycamore, I believe, on top of it. So you can even see here some pencil lines that I've drawn in. This I could never ever do this freehand. It would be sorry, not freehand. I can never carve this without the lines. Even when I do put the lines in, I it doesn't look good. I erase them. I move them around. You have to be a real true artist to be able to just walk up to a piece of wood and carve that into it. And I'm not that kind of guy. Sadly, I wish I was. Um, so these main lines, and then you can see there's all this little bit of texture. That's actually texture if you listen. Hopefully you can hear that. But see if I can get that a little closer for you. Yeah, and these main lines are done with a V gouge, and these smaller little cross hatches are also done with a V gouge. Now I'm getting ahead of myself here, but these little divots are done with an awl. Just press it in, and these little X's, they are done also with a V gouge. So there's really only one V gouge and one awl and a pencil to lay this all out, and that's all that's used there. So to sum up your question, it totally depends on the pattern you're going for and the look that you're going for, right? A quick thought on inspiration, because that could be a whole other webinar. This was a very similar pattern that I saw on our window during the winter, and there was just these beautiful, beautiful patterns of frost, and I took a bunch of pictures of them and just sort of extrapolated them and took a little bit of design liberty, and that's where this came from. But this is all just stuff I'm fiddling around with and trying this, trying that. Oh, that looks ugly. Oh, that looks pretty good. I'll change that a little bit. A lot of different techniques that I've used, and I'm not showing you the ugly ones because I usually throw those pieces away. But there's a lot of samples that I've taken and worked with, and then used in a real piece, right? All of these I could probably send you photos of the piece that I eventually made that had that texture on it. So that's a little bit about the inspiration side of things, right? You can look into nature, you can look into architecture, the world around you, all those sorts of things. Even look at other pieces of furniture, right? There's a lot of furniture. You can go on the internet. There's different books, and if someone made something cool, or even just a leg that was interesting, or a shape of a tabletop that had some texture on it, give that a shot. You can give them credit for it. You don't have to, it's not your own, but that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Uh,
I
other
do have
thoughts, questions?
yeah, I have a couple more here, Rob.
Sure.
The first one, I have seen gouges with round, short handle versus long, straight handle. Are they for different usage?
Um, I have a little gouge like this. This is a shorter handle. Um, it's probably for more intricate work, but at the end of the day, this is a V gouge. This is a V gouge. This one can cut a little bit deeper. And this one may be a bit easier to handle, especially if you're doing, angled stuff, turning that sort of thing. Not turning on a lathe, but turning the actual groove that you're making. But basically, they're very similar things. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so this one, I'm not sure if you're able to do this, but someone is asking if you could carve a line to show how it works. I have never tried the two-handed technique.
Sure. Um, yeah, let's get a, you got your, yeah, got a clamp here. I'm just going to use this piece of poplar laying around. Usually I would do this on my bench, but then you couldn't see what I'm doing. Um, doesn't go anywhere. So let's say if I wanted to do some sort of a, probably can't quite see what I'm doing very well, but you'll get a, there's just a very gradual S curve. So I've got, as I mentioned, fingers down. I've got my anchored heel there. Well, I'm getting old. I've got to take my glasses off to see this. Oops. Hoping to show you that chip there, but I will show you the groove that I made, and I mean, I'll add a few more. So there's three quick grooves, just just playing around. Actually, now that we do this, got another idea here. Okay, I could play around with that all night, but I shouldn't. So, so there's the wood little chips, and that's what I've carved into it, right? First main one, as well as a couple on either side of that. And I mean, let's just extrapolate that to a, let's pretend this is a small side table, right? This is only about 12 inches long by 6 inches wide, but just, double it in size, and there's your side table. And it has that going down the center, right? Hard to see it, but yeah, that's, and maybe there's your texture for your whole piece, right? Or maybe you add a slight curve into the leg that kind of pulls from this curve and is put into the leg, right? So I mean, that's a really simple sort of example, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how hard it was, how long it took, and just play around, right? I think that's a really quite a nice curve myself. I have to keep that one and play around with that a bit. Any other questions?
It looks really, really nice. That is it for questions right now.
Sure. Okay, so that was carving gouges, and surprisingly, probably took too long on those. So the next thing I'd like to talk to you about is rotary tool. I won't spend as long with this one, but it can be a simple Dremel. It can be a pneumatic rotary tool. Um, you know, usually I use this bit, right? Uh, it's probably a maybe a 3/16 inch diameter bit, maybe smaller, and it's just round. And man, oh man, I have machined probably 10,000 little divots with this exact bit, right? Again, patience is super critical, super critical. And one thing I find with this is that as you're moving, it's sort of like the texture I showed you. Um, oh, yeah, here, but with the carving gouges, it's quite large, and with this, it's very, very small, obviously. But I have them in a vague row, and they work nicely, just sort of offset a little bit each different row, but not perfection. That's not what I'm aiming for. And when I use that technique, generally I aim for, I have another great example of it, but I generally aim to, how do I explain this? To texture the whole surface. It doesn't mean the whole tabletop, but usually what I do is I'll have some sort of a border, and I'll texture within that border. Now this is a little box. Just it's more for decoration than anything really. But as you can see, um, that's the texture on the top, and I've mimicked it on the bottom, and I've just added that little V groove across it just to give it a border, and then I've textured this whole surface, right? But as you can see, there's no flats left on that surface. It was all textured. That's not a rule. Maybe you don't like that, and you texture it so that there is some flats there. I just prefer the vast majority of the surface to be that texture. But as you can imagine, all those little divots take time, right? So don't start with the dining room table and pretend like you're gonna add that to the whole tabletop. We're talking about little details. Handles are so good. Even if you can't see it on the underside of a wooden handle, every time you grasp it, you can touch that texture, right? That's what I'm talking about. There's a visual texture and there's the physical texture that you can see. So the visual texture and the physical texture that you can feel, right? And something like that on the underside of a handle, you would feel it. And that would be a really, really beautiful detail as far as I'm concerned. And you can add that to, a little band across a leg, separated by two V grooves, that sort of thing. Um, I mean, there's literally thousands of ways, thousands of approaches to do that. So once you have your bit chucked in the rotary tool, play around with different speeds. And this is one that you'll find that the harder woods, they'll just be a lot slower, right? So you really have to take your time with a harder wood. But essentially, I'm doing the same thing, uh, vaguely same thing as with the carving gouge. I'm having some sort of uh, uh, you know uh, pressure with one part of my hand as I slowly, methodically go through and texture all that the field, depending on how large it is, right? And you'll find yourself, if you're anything like me, you find yourself getting faster and faster, and the effects getting worse and worse. And once you get to the other end, you go, "Oh wow, the start looked great, but the end, I was way too fast." And you realize you really do have to go slow. Each one of those divots actually has to be pressed in to the proper depth for the effect you want, and a certain distance away from the other one. I don't want to make it sound too hard and too crazy, but that's why I just say start small, right? Start small and go up from there. Right? So because we're already 40 minutes into this, I'm going to stop there with this one. But is there any questions about using rotary tool for that texture?
There is a question. It's about finishing though. So any differences in applying a finish to carving?
Yes, I'll get to that in a sec.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah,
It,
that's
yeah,
yeah.
that's an important one.
Mhm.
So those are my two favorites, right? You got your rotary tool, and my favorites overall is going to be probably the carving gouges. But a lot of other ways to add texture. Boy, oh boy, so many. This was done with a router. So all I did was have a template guide on my router's base with a round nosed bit, and the router. Then I made a template, a curved template, clamped it to this, and was able to machine that groove in there. And I would did that for all of these series of edges. And then I used my grinder with power carving equipment to level that, take it from this high peak down into this valley, and make that all flat with a few hand planes and spoke shave, that sort of thing. So there's some pretty cool texture with a router. Here's another example of something I did with a router. We did an article on this, oh boy, probably 12 years ago. A little drawer, and ignore the veneer detail in there. That's something else. But it's just a round nose bit that I've used a straight edge, a 90-degree straight edge. So you clamp that on there, run one groove, move it over the proper width, run another one, move it over, repeat until you get all this series here, right? And it feels really cool. It looks great, and it's just with a simple router, right? As long as you have set it up so that you're moving it over same width each time, you're left with a really cool surface. And that could be, I don't know, maybe that's an apron on a table, right? It goes all the way across. You can see it and you can feel it. That could be an edge of a tabletop. There's so many options, right? So many options. And that's just one option. Change the bit and you have a different approach to texturing with a router, right? And that's great because most of us already have a router, right? Corey, do you say something?
All right. Yeah. I did have a couple more questions come in.
Sure.
Okay. Several years ago, you wrote an article on how to make a curved lid box. The lid had a walnut or mahogany inlay.
Mhm.
Um, can you quickly review on how you did that? Did you use the rotary tool?
I used a scroll saw for that, actually. That's called pierced carving. And I mean, it technically does add some texture to it. I wasn't going to talk about that today, though. A lot of fun, but pierced carving is sort of another um, technique that you could use. Yeah, lots of fun. So yeah, check out that article.
Perfect. Okay, the other one, how do you use a rotary tool on open grain wood like oak? When I try it, usually wants to follow the grain and not the path I want, especially for thin lines.
Yeah, it's tricky because, as I said off the top, choosing wood is really important. So if you know you want to texture the top, for instance, try using that same species of material and see what effect you get. The um, the burr on that rotary tool that I'm using, you can use the larger ones, but it's harder. The burr that I'm using is really quite a small one, and the grain on something like face grain red oak, it just doesn't accept it very well because it is so loose in parts, right? It's ring porous. So I don't recommend. I wouldn't tell you tips on how to make it better, other than don't do it. I would use a maple, a walnut, cherry, one of the other woods, um, or yeah, that would really be my advice to just not do that.
Okay, great. That's it for now. Thanks.
Okay. Uh, One thing I forget. I mentioned this before, but it's an all very simple way to texture. It's more of a visual texture than something you can feel, but all these little dots in here, now they just they're only a small part of this. They just add a little bit. But if you were to have a small area, let's say on the underside of that handle again, or across the knee of a leg or something like that, you could create a little bit of texture, super easy. And if it wasn't big enough, you could even try it with a nail. Just take a nail, a hammer, just tap, 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 tap all around that area, and you'll get, you'll get that visual texture quite strong. You could even have some sort of center area that you've textured in a different way, and then you add this around it, right? Even a border or something like that. So there's many options that way. Even something like a chisel, or sorry, a file, right? Uh, just a basic file. You could take it across. Just try this for you. You could, if this was I don't know, a tabletop or an edge of a door or something like that, you could use the file to create a series of gouges. So I won't do this forever, but and if I had more time, I would do them a little bit deeper. Um, but it's just an interesting little design detail, and I promise you'll be reaching for that that little box or that piece of furniture or whatever it is, right? You can do vaguely similar things with chisels. You could carve into that edge and then come back on the other side and take out little V blocks essentially, and it leaves you with that just an interesting feeling, right, and an interesting look as well. Another approach is to use an angle grinder. I mentioned it before, and it didn't create so much texture on this piece, but as you can imagine, you could also create these type of curved ribs or whatnot, flowing surfaces with an angle grinder, and that's not always, but it's usually going to be more of a larger texture. With a rotary, you're dealing with a tiny texture. Um, More often than not, with a grinder and carving attachments, you're going to be creating more, less tight texture that way. So we only have 12 more minutes here, so I really want to talk about finishing. First, spend about 30 seconds on sanding. Usually what I do is before I texture the piece, um, that's when I'll sand it, right? And then the you you I very rarely, I almost never actually sand the actual texture because you're using a sharp gouge, you're using a sharp chisel or whatever it is, and I don't want to sand off those crisp edges, right? Maybe if it's with the rotary tool, I might take a really light, like a 220, and just lightly sand that surface until it's so there's not a lot of fibers that are on that surface, right? Um, but that's about all I would do. So mostly sand beforehand, and only if you really need to, just lightly sand that texture afterwards. Now, the only time I would sand um, a surface afterwards as well is if I have left some pencil lines on, right? Let's say you've drawn some pencil lines on for layout and you've carved them, but your carving isn't perfect, or you even had a new inspiration and instead of going this way, you want to go a little wider or something like that, and you've left some pencil lines on, then you can just sand them off with a fairly fine grain, a fine grit sandpaper. But as a rule, sand first, then texture. That's the way to go. So finishing, more of an art than a science here, right? Um, so there's really no true do's and don'ts when it comes to finishing, right? Again, make a test panel, go over, make the texture, add the finish as you want to, see how it works. You might be surprised how easy it is, might be surprised about how hard it is, right? So there's basically two questions you got to ask yourself. How do you apply the finish? And then how do you sand the cured finish after between each coat, right? So let's talk about applying the finish. A brush is fine. You can brush it on a textured panel, but you may very well find that the finish is pooling into different areas, right? So you're just, I mean, it's just simply pooling that finish, and that's a problem, right? You want an even coat on there. So I would say that generally speaking, I wouldn't brush. So let's move on to another option, wiping, right? Wiping is an option that sometimes can work well and sometimes works poorly. The main problem with wiping is if you're dealing with a finer texture, like in this box, and you have a lot of little fibers, little edges, and you're leaving a lot of fibers of the from the cloth behind. It's I've ruined a piece before. I had to completely start over with part of it because I applied it. It was a darker wood, and I put on a finish with a lighter colored cloth, and it took all these little white fibers, and they all stuck. It was I tried to get it off. I tried to salvage it. Impossible because there's so many little, as you can imagine, it just sticks there. So again, practice with a panel, right? Wiping would work a lot better on something like this, right? Where you can wipe with the grooves, you can press it in there, but you can also use a drier cloth to also get in there and wipe out any of the excess, right? Now, one other approach to finishing is spraying, right? Spraying almost always works great if you have the spray equipment. Or another option is to have a spray bottle. I just happen to have these nearby, oil-based poly. This is a simple lacquer. If you're doing a big armoire, that price will add up. But if you're doing a small bowl, small box, even a side table or something like that, one can will probably do the whole table, right? It allows you to put on an even coat, get into all of those divots, grooves, whatever it is, right? You don't leave any fibers behind, um, and it usually works pretty well. So then we get into the other half of this, as I mentioned, is how do you sand between coats, right? Again, more art than science here. There are times when I will just sand the surface with a block and a 220 grit or something like that, and not worry at all about all of the little grooves. I don't get in there and go down each one of those grooves with any sandpaper. If it does leave a little bit of texture or bumpiness on that, you're not really going to feel it, right? When you run your hand over this, see it a bit closer. It's just all a bunch of V grooves. If you run your hand over this, you're only on the upper surfaces. You're not going down into each one of those V grooves, so you don't need them smooth, right? It gets trickier when you're dealing with the finer surfaces like that, right? Again, I would probably just take like a really fine, a 220, 320 sandpaper and just focus on the outer surface, right? There's no way you're going to get into all of those little divots. Not an option. Same with this sort of thing, right? This is a piece of plywood with a few layers of veneer that I've carved into. So that's a whole other thing. But if I did put a coat of finish on this, because these grooves are larger, the first thing I do is sand the whole surface, and and just see how it feels. Right? If it feels good, and the slight roughness in each one of these is fine, I would leave it like that. But if for whatever reason, if this was going to be touched a lot, if it was visually rough or physically rough, I might even get in there with a piece of sandpaper to do that, and to get into a lot of those. I would probably just go at about this speed and work my way through all of those just quickly once. That's really all you need. Stay clear of steel wool. Steel wool will all kinds of little bits will get stuck in there, and nothing will frustrate you more than that. So yes, don't do steel wool. Learn from my mistakes. Don't do steel wool. Um, okay, I could go on a little bit about finishing, but we have a few more minutes. We'll probably take a couple questions.
I just have one, and I'm not sure if you really touched on it or answered this question, but would you use a soft bristle brush or a brass wire brush? I think that was specific to one of the pieces you were talking about, but
Do you think it was to do with
it was at the
finishing?
beginning. It was at the beginning, yeah, of when you started talking about it.
Hmm. Um, I have used a bristle brush, um, yeah, right over there, and I have a rotary one too. You put in a drill, and I've created texture with, wearing away some of the early wood, leaving the late wood, so that you get a more worn effect. And it works quite well, especially on a softwood like, fir, spruce, something like that. Even an oak, more of a grainy hardwood. It'll remove those softer early wood layers, and it works quite well. Yeah, that's not really a technique that I talked about in this, but it does add a very sort of natural texture across the whole piece.
Okay.
Absolutely.
He did clarify that it was surface prep prior to finishing.
Ah, unless you want that slightly distressed look, I would not do that. Yeah, I just think that it's too rough, it's too aggressive of an approach for more of a fine technique, I would say.
Perfect. Okay, one other question. What about using a soft sponge type sanding block?
It's possible, depending on the type of technique you've used to texture, that is an option for kind of getting into that texture a little bit. I could see that potentially working on something like V grooves, where you hold that on an angle and you're just able to go across each one of those grooves and just quickly smooth it out a little bit. But it could be a very tedious job. And also realize that the more you work each one of those V grooves, the more, um, a sharp gouge is going to leave a really smooth surface there, right? It's smooth to the feel, it's smooth to the eye, and the more we sand it, the more we work it, we're taking a perfect surface and we're working it, right? We're making it less perfect in my mind. So yeah, it's a possibility. I guess that's all I could say about that one.
Perfect. Okay. I think that's it for questions.
Right, 8 o'clock, right on the money. So
Yes, good. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rob. That was really, really informative. I think everybody really enjoyed it. Thank you again to Record Power. And thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. And stay tuned. We have more webinars coming up in 2025, but that's it for this year.
yep. Merry Christmas, everybody.